It's been 5.5 years since Nintendo Switch Online launched into its full paid version. That, of course, came along with original Nintendo games and eventually others that followed it. And when it first came out, I was very critical of it and had a lot of questions for Nintendo, how they'd handle things going forward. And since then, looking back on it now, it does appear that Nintendo may have in some way answered a lot of the questions. And this kind of was spurred on when I was visiting with family recently, and my nephews actually subscribed to the basic version of NSO, and they seemed absolutely floored with the amount of games that were just presented to them. So I wanted to go over that here today as I took a look back now at the library that, let's say, you sign up for just outright, what you're presented with. And all right, I gotta give it to Nintendo. It's actually kind of impressive, so we'll go over that. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure that like button and subscribe if you're new. With the launch of the Nintendo Switch Online features like cloud saves, game trials, original titles like Tetris 99, and of course, online play, we're all locked behind a $20 fee. To accompany this and make what was a bare bones online experience compared to other platforms feel more valuable, 20 original Nintendo games were included. And now with the Switch, this basically replaces Virtual Console from previous generations with the Wii and the Wii U. There's an ongoing debate which one's better, NSO or Virtual Console, where you just buy individual games as you want them. And I think there's pros and cons either way, one being a subscription-based service that if you stop paying that annual fee, it'll just all go away. But on the other side, you have to buy each individual game outright, which can become very, very expensive, obviously, over time if you want the number of titles that are there with NSO. The one thing that always gets me when it comes to backing NSO over Virtual Console is the idea that these games will go forward with us, as in beyond, like in between generations. So the next generation, we assume NSO will carry over with all of these games. You sign in and it's all there. Whereas with Virtual Console, you went from the Wii to the Wii U, you had to buy the games all over again. I don't really think pointing out Nintendo's ineptitude when it comes to account management and support is a good reason for NSO to be better. I just think it just points out that Nintendo should have figured out their account system a long time ago. A lot of those Virtual Console games you build on the Wii U should work on the Switch, but they don't. So I can't necessarily buy in 100% that NSO in its current form will absolutely carry over to next generation, but I am fully expecting that, so here's hoping Nintendo doesn't let me down on that one. The games at launch were Soccer, Tennis, Donkey Kong, Mario Bros, Super Mario Bros, Balloon Fight, Ice Climber, Dr. Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Bros. 3, Double Dragon, River City Ransom, Ghosts and Goblins, Tecmo Bowl, Gradius, Pro Wrestling, Excite Bike, Yoshi, Ice Hockey, and Baseball. It was a pretty standard lineup of games, sure, but the ability to play something like Tecmo Bowl online against friends did add a nice twist to games that were decades old at this point. Still, I had a lot of questions around how Nintendo would handle the rollout of more titles in the future, and I really wasn't sold on the 8-bit generation holding up a lackluster online experience, missing something as basic as messaging someone on your friends list. And I do still think, looking back on it, that at this time, the questions, the criticism, all of that was very valid. We just were very unsure as to how Nintendo would handle this going forward, and if they would be able to add significant value to this sort of a service that doesn't necessarily rely on just having your save cloud stuff locked behind that fee, which technically it still is. You can't back up this stuff offline to a USB stick or back up to your external SD card. It's all still there with a paywall in mind to back up your saves, which is still wild to think about. It's like, that's still really locked behind an annual fee, but yeah, it is. One way or the other, if you wanted to play online, you were going to pay the $20 per year with or without the NES games being interesting. It's something these platform holders have pretty much instilled in console owners, that paying $60 or even $80 a year is a necessary fee. It's something that is definitely an annoyance, and I'd like to see the industry revert their stance on this in the future, but asking corporations to give up what has become a relied on revenue stream of millions and millions of dollars brings up memories of this meme. Anyway, Nintendo did continue to roll out NES games each month, and in September 2019, 1 year after launching that NES game library, Super Nintendo games were added to the service. As part of the launch, 20 games were added to the service under the new app, which included Super Mario World, Super Mario Kart, The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, Super Metroid Stunt Race FX, Kirby's Dream Land 3, Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, Star Fox, F-Zero, Pilot Wings, Kirby's Dream Course, Brawl Brothers, Breath of Fire, Demon's Crest, Joe and Mac 2, Lost in the Tropics, Super EDF, Earth Defense Force, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Super Puyo Puyo 2, it's available for first time in the US, and Super Soccer along with Super Tennis. Really, when I started seeing the 16-bit games show up here with Super Nintendo, it did feel like, okay, this is becoming much more worth it, much more valuable, because I believe the 16-bit era has aged way better than the 8-bit generation. I think 16-bit games with the 2D platforming was like an incredible time. It really was. And games from that era have still aged beautifully. Super Mario World is still one of the best platformers you can play right now. And A Link to the Past, I still feel like, is the best Zelda game ever released. All of that happening on the Super Nintendo. Following the path set up by the NES games, Nintendo continued to drop in a mixture of NES and Super NES titles each month. There were also these SP variants added in on occasion that were pretty much just ROM hacks and save states. Still, it added some extra variety and surprise to the app, since these weren't usually part of the announcements and would just show up in your application when you open it up. 2.5 years later, Nintendo did announce Game Boy and Game Boy Color games would be available to the basic tier, with 9 games launching right away. These included Tetris, Super Mario Land 2, Zelda Link's Awakening DX, Gargoyle's Quest, Game & Watch Gallery 3, Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare, Metroid 2, Wario Land 3, and Kirby's Dream Land. The inclusion of Game Boy Color was a nice touch here, with Nintendo separating them from the regular Game Boy games and taking variants like Link's Awakening that can use the Game Boy Color for extra content. The Game Boy was the most recent system addition to NSO, and since then, Nintendo has continued to stack up games for each application, and interestingly enough, have not removed any games from this retro catalog. This is typically a big drawback for a subscription service like this. As games go in, some games will leave. Most times, this is due to license agreements for how long a game is essentially rented by the platform holder to remain in the service. While Nintendo does own a large number of games currently in NSO, there are still many third-party titles that have stuck around since launch. And since games haven't been subtracted from the service, that means Nintendo has only been building and building and building when it comes to these libraries, and they've actually ballooned in size, and it's happened kind of on a slow ramp up to the point where even I was unaware of just how many games are available at this time. Nintendo Life has managed to keep a running tally of how many games are available in each app, showing just how impressive this aspect is to the $20 service. For NES, they have it recorded at 78 games, with Super Nintendo at 63 games, and Game Boy at 29 games. This isn't counting region-specific titles for places like Japan or the different SP versions. All in, however, we have a total of 170 different games under the basic service. When I look at the list of games they have on offer, it's actually pretty impressive. Sure, there are definitely some throwaway games in there that some may fire up for a few minutes just to see what it is and then never touch it again. But there are also some absolute classic must-play games in here as well. It's become a very easy thing to recommend to new Switch owners now, as opposed to years ago when it first launched. Being able to jump from Punch-Out on the NES to Earthbound on the Super Nintendo to Oracle of Ages on the Game Boy in a matter of seconds, that's pretty awesome. They even got Pokemon Trading Card Game on here, which is basically GOAT status at this point. The number of games here is borderline overwhelming for a new subscriber, since every one of these games is just accessible from the outset. And trust me, I know you can achieve the same results by just using an emulator and downloading some ROMs online, even setting it up for online play. But this is so clearly targeting a mainstream audience that does not want to jump through all of those hoops to figure that out, whether it's websites to get the ROMs from safely or setting up connections with friends so they can play something like Tecmo Bowl online. The idea here is part of that $20 a year value. You don't really have to think about it. It's there, it works, you hit a few buttons, you launch an application, you guys are playing whatever you want, even together, like I mentioned, online. And that is Nintendo's strategy here, is to play into the mainstream audience that does significantly outnumber the hardcore audience. With all this said, there's something strange about this whole setup right now. I look at the offering and then look at the price, and something doesn't really add up here. I say this because Nintendo tends to value their properties very highly, and while they have introduced a $50 tier, this $20 price point seems extremely cheap based on their history. I wouldn't be shocked if a price increase was on the horizon for this service, maybe to usher in the next generation. They move pricing up to $30 a year or something, and just point out how many games are available as the reasoning. Also, inflation. That's usually an excuse all these streaming service companies make to charge you more. It certainly sounds funny to ask questions around a good value from a company when it comes to a subscription service like this, but remember, this is Nintendo, and typically we talk about how they will overcharge for things, something like Luigi's Mansion 2 HD or Donkey Kong Country Returns, those both being full price, and then you look over at 170 games for $20 a year, and you can kind of see how those sort of clash. I did question Nintendo quite a bit with the launch of NSO, the 20 or so NES games. What would their rollout be? Even along the way with some of the weaker announcements for games. I mean, I was there asking how they were going to make all this work, even at $20 per year with a, say, stripped down online experience compared to their competitors. And now looking back on it, while the online experience hasn't really gotten that much better, the overwhelming value when it comes to their legacy titles in this subscription service is very difficult to argue with, and even at $20 per year, feels undervalued. So I think right now this is an easy service to recommend, and Nintendo has actually done a very good job throughout this generation, adding more and more games, eclipsing the 170 game mark when you sign up, immediately being available to you. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below with how Nintendo has handled this rollout throughout the entire generation. If you are on the basic tier, do you feel like you're getting your money's worth for it? Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.